The morning began like any other in the heart of the city. The streets outside the bank were busy with people hurrying to work, cars honking as they passed, and the faint sound of coffee shop chatter drifting through the air. Inside the bank, everything felt calm. The walls were lined with posters about saving plans and loans. The faint smell of paper and ink filled the room, and the hum of the air conditioner was the only background music for the staff who had already settled into their tasks. Daniel, the young bank teller, adjusted his tie and sat behind his counter. He had been working at the bank for almost 2 years, and by now the routine of his job felt predictable. Every morning he would switch on his computer, count the cash in his drawer, and prepare for the long day of transactions. He often thought the job was dull, but he also enjoyed the small interactions with people. Sometimes it was a quick smile, sometimes a short joke, and other times a complaint he had to listen to. This morning seemed no different. An older man walked in first, wearing a hat and carrying a worn leather wallet. He came every Monday to deposit money, and Daniel greeted him with a polite smile. Next came a young woman holding a stack of checks. She looked impatient as she tapped her fingers on the counter. Daniel worked quickly to process her request, thinking of how many times he had seen that same frustrated look. The lobby filled slowly with a mix of people, a mother with her child waiting in line, a businessman talking loudly on his phone, and an elderly couple asking about their retirement account. For Daniel, it was all part of the pattern he had grown used to. He leaned back in his chair during a short pause, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was not even 10 o'clock yet, and he already felt the weight of the long day ahead. Still, there was something he enjoyed about watching people. Everyone who walked through the glass doors brought with them a piece of their own story. Some looked tired, some hopeful, some worried. He often imagined what their lives might be like outside the bank. The mother with the child probably had errands to run. The businessman was likely rushing to close a deal, and the elderly couple might be planning a quiet afternoon together. It was like watching 100 small stories pass through his desk each week, and in a way that entertained him. But Daniel also had a playful side. Sometimes he found amusement in spotting unusual details, like the way people dressed, the way they spoke, or even how seriously they acted over the smallest tasks. He often whispered small jokes to his colleague at the next counter, making the long hours feel a little lighter to him. The bank was not just a workplace, it was also a stage where people unknowingly played their roles, and he was one of the quiet observers. On that particular morning, Daniel was in a good mood. He had grabbed a strong cup of coffee on his way in, and he felt more awake than usual. His fingers tapped lightly on the desk as he waited for the next customer. He wondered if anything interesting would happen today, or if it would be another day that disappeared into the blur of routine. He thought about how most mornings felt the same. A few polite greetings, endless clicking on the keyboard, and stacks of receipts. Nothing ever truly surprising happened, and maybe that was why the job felt so safe, so normal. Outside the glass doors, a man paused before walking in. Daniel noticed him only for a moment. He was tall, dressed in simple jeans and a jacket. Nothing flashy or out of place. Daniel thought little of it, turning back to his computer screen as he prepared for another ordinary transaction. He didn't know, of course, that this small detail, the entrance of this quiet man, would change the rhythm of his day completely. The line moved forward, and Daniel helped another customer. He counted cash, printed receipts, and made small talk. The usual phrases filled the air. "How would you like that withdrawn?" "Please sign here. Thank you. Have a nice day." It was almost automatic. Like a song he had sung too many times before. He sighed quietly, wondering how many more hours until lunch. The man from outside finally stepped into the line. Blending in with everyone else, Daniel glanced at him again, thinking he looked familiar but not immediately placing where he had seen that face. It was one of those moments when recognition lingers at the edge of your mind. Like a word you can't quite remember, Daniel shrugged it off, assuming it was just someone who reminded him of a movie character or a customer he had seen before. The atmosphere inside the bank remained calm. But Daniel had no idea that the ordinary morning was about to take an extraordinary turn. The hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of papers, the clicking of keys, all of it seemed so routine. Yet in just a few minutes, his day would shift from dull repetition to a story he would never forget. For now, though, Daniel leaned forward, ready to greet the next person in line. To him, it was still just another ordinary day at the bank, but fate was already arranging something far less ordinary. The glass doors of the bank opened with a soft push, letting in a tall man who moved quietly. His steps were steady, his clothes simple, and nothing about him shouted for attention. He wore a plain jacket, a faded pair of jeans, and sneakers that looked as ordinary as anyone else's. For most people, he could have been just another customer with errands to run. But for Daniel, something about him caught the eye. The man's face looked familiar, almost too familiar. It was the kind of face Daniel had seen hundreds of times before, but not in real life. More like on a movie screen. Still, the idea felt so ridiculous that Daniel brushed it off immediately. Why would someone like that walk into his bank on a quiet morning? Without cameras, without bodyguards, without anything that hinted at fame, Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair. His curiosity piqued. The line moved slowly, and the man joined it without complaint. He didn't carry himself with arrogance, nor did he look like someone trying to hide. His head was slightly lowered, his expression calm, almost peaceful if anything. He looked like a man enjoying the freedom of being unnoticed. The people in line around him didn't seem to realize who he was. The mother with the restless child glanced at him briefly. The businessman on his phone didn't even lift his eyes, and the elderly couple near the front of the line paid him no attention at all. It was almost funny to Daniel, watching this man who looked so much like Keanu Reeves, standing in the middle of everyday people. Completely unrecognized, Daniel couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. He whispered to his colleague at the next counter, "Doesn't that guy look like Keanu Reeves?" His colleague glanced over, squinted for a moment, then shrugged and returned to her screen. She didn't seem convinced, and Daniel laughed quietly again. Shaking his head, the idea seemed too absurd. Celebrities didn't just walk into their bank branch like it was the most normal thing in the world. As the man moved closer in line, Daniel studied him more carefully. The resemblance was uncanny. The strong jawline, the tired but kind eyes, the slightly unkempt hair that framed his face. Yet everything else seemed too ordinary. The jacket looked like it had been worn many times. The shoes had small creases, and his posture was relaxed. If this was Keanu Reeves, he certainly wasn't acting like the larger-than-life movie star Daniel had seen in blockbuster posters. By the time the man was just 2 customers away, Daniel felt a strange mix of amusement and disbelief. He found himself wondering what he would even say if it truly was Keanu. Would he ask for an autograph? Would he make a joke? Or would he just treat him like any other client? Part of him wanted to laugh at the thought, while another part of him wondered if he was missing something important. Finally, the man stepped forward and Daniel raised his head to greet him. The words caught in his throat for just a second, because up close the resemblance was even stronger. The man's voice was calm, almost gentle when he spoke. "Good morning. I'd like to access my account." His tone carried no arrogance, no demand for special treatment. It was polite, steady, and almost too normal for someone of his status. Daniel felt a grin tug at his lips. He still didn't fully believe it, and part of him thought this was just another customer who happened to look like Keanu Reeves. After all, the world was full of people who resembled celebrities. And yet deep down there was a flicker of doubt, something in the man's eyes that felt too genuine to ignore. As Daniel typed the request into his computer, he tried to act casual, but inside, he was battling with the idea that this could actually be real. His fingers moved over the keyboard as he asked the routine questions. "Can I have your ID, sir? And could you please confirm your account number?" The man nodded and handed over a simple card. The ID bore the name Keanu Charles Reeves. Daniel blinked twice, staring at it longer than necessary. His laugh came out awkwardly, as though he was trying to mask his surprise. Surely this had to be some kind of joke, some prank. Maybe a fan with the same name who liked to play tricks? The man gave a small smile, as though he could sense Daniel's disbelief but didn't mind. He stood patiently, hands resting lightly on the counter, waiting for the teller to do his work. There was nothing showy about him, nothing that screamed he wanted to be recognized. If anything, he seemed to prefer the quietness of the moment. Daniel's mind raced. Should he treat him like the star he might be, or should he keep laughing at the thought that this was just a coincidence? He glanced once more at the ID. Then at the man's calm face. The pieces were slowly coming together. And yet he wasn't ready to believe it fully, not yet. To Daniel, it was still just an unexpected customer who looked far too much like someone from the big screen, but he didn't know that in just a few more clicks on his computer. The truth would reveal itself in a way that would make his casual laughter vanish. His ordinary morning was no longer ordinary. And the unexpected customer in front of him was about to change the entire tone of his day. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair as he looked at the ID once more. The name was printed clearly, and the photograph matched the face standing in front of him. His lips curled into a grin, almost mocking. He shook his head as if telling himself not to get carried away. Yeah, right, he thought. Keanu Reeves walking into my bank. That's a good one. The thought felt too strange. Too far from his everyday reality, after all. Celebrities didn't wait in lines. They didn't stand with ordinary customers, and they certainly didn't handle bank errands on their own. They had assistants or managers who took care of such things. That was how Daniel pictured their lives: fast cars, private offices, velvet ropes, and exclusive treatment everywhere they went. So the idea of this humble man being that Keanu Reeves made Daniel laugh quietly again. He couldn't stop himself. He looked over at his colleague and raised his eyebrows. Tilting his head slightly toward the customer, she barely reacted, too focused on her own work. That made Daniel chuckle even more, he thought to himself. I must be the only one in this room who sees the joke. But there was another side to his reaction, too. It wasn't only disbelief, it was a hint of arrogance. Daniel felt safe behind the counter, comfortable in his role as the teller. He thought of himself as the one in charge of the transaction, the one who decided how things were processed. Even if this man looked like a famous actor, Daniel was the one with the keyboard and the account screen in front of him. That gave him confidence, almost a sense of power. He cleared his throat and asked in a slightly teasing tone, "And how can I help you today, sir?" His words were polite on the surface, but the little smirk on his lips gave away his disbelief. He thought it was amusing to play along with the idea. Treating this man as though he were an imposter, the customer didn't seem bothered at all. He simply smiled back gently and repeated his request. "I'd like to access my account." His voice was steady, almost soft. And there was not the slightest trace of irritation. He could sense the teller's doubt, but he didn't let it trouble him. Instead, he remained calm, as if he had been in situations like this many times before. Daniel, however, continued to feel entertained. He typed slowly on his keyboard, dragging out the moment. He even leaned back in his chair for a second, glancing at the line behind the man. A few people were starting to shift impatiently, but Daniel barely noticed. He was caught in his own little game inside his mind. Daniel was building a whole story. Maybe this was a local guy who just happened to look like Keanu. Maybe he liked the attention, showing off his resemblance to strangers. Maybe he even used the name Keanu Reeves as a joke. Daniel had seen people like that before. People who lived for the thrill of pretending. So he laughed again quietly, telling himself that he wasn't going to be fooled so easily. The man's patience was remarkable. He stood there without complaint, his posture relaxed, his hands resting gently on the counter. He looked Daniel directly in the eyes, and there was a kindness in that gaze, something steady and unshaken, but Daniel didn't fully notice it. He was too focused on convincing himself that this couldn't be real. In the back of his mind, Daniel thought about the stories he'd heard of celebrities showing up in strange places. He remembered reading articles about stars taking the subway or eating at small diners. But those always felt like rare exceptions, not something that would ever happen in his quiet corner of the city. That made him dismiss the possibility even more quickly. He even muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable," shaking his head slightly as he clicked through the screens on his computer. His chuckle slipped out once more, and though it wasn't loud, the customer surely noticed it. Still, the man didn't react. He simply waited, with the same calmness he had walked in with. Daniel's mind was now split. On one side, he was amused, enjoying his private joke. On the other side, there was a nagging feeling, a small voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, he was standing face to face with the real Keanu Reeves. But that voice was easy to push aside, because laughter was safer. Disbelief was easier. The people in line were starting to grow restless. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve. The businessman sighed heavily into his phone, and the elderly couple leaned closer to each other, whispering. Daniel, however, remained caught in his own little bubble. He leaned forward, smirk still on his lips, and said, "All right, let's see what kind of account we've got here," as though preparing himself for a joke to be revealed. For Daniel, this was still just entertainment, a small distraction from his boring routine. He believed he was in control of the situation. He believed he was right to laugh. He believed the world worked the way he imagined, celebrities in their high towers, ordinary people in lines at the bank. Nothing in his mind could connect the two. But what he didn't realize was that his disbelief, his casual laughter, and his dismissive attitude were about to collide with a truth he could not deny. The computer screen in front of him was only seconds away from proving him wrong. And the smirk on his lips would soon vanish, replaced by the shock of reality. Daniel adjusted his chair and leaned closer to the computer. He was still half smiling, half shaking his head, convinced this whole situation was nothing more than a funny coincidence. The man in front of him stood patiently, waiting for the process to begin. His calmness only made Daniel more curious. Most customers grew restless if a teller took too long. But this man seemed completely at ease, as though he had all the time in the world. "All right, sir," Daniel said in a tone that mixed politeness with a hint of sarcasm. "Let's get you taken care of." He clicked into the account system and began typing, asking for the usual details. The man leaned slightly forward, not to invade space but simply to listen carefully. "Here's my account number," he said softly, sliding a small slip of paper across the counter. Daniel picked it up, glancing at the neat handwriting. The digits looked ordinary, just like any other account number he had seen thousands of times before. He entered them into the system while still holding on to his private joke. Imagine if this really is Keanu Reeves, he thought with a silent chuckle. Coming in here like he's just another guy. "Can you please confirm your ID again?" Daniel asked. The man nodded politely and handed it over without a word. Daniel glanced at the card, still convinced it must be fake or a coincidence. He looked at the photograph, then at the real face before him. The resemblance was undeniable, but his mind refused to accept it. The routine continued. Daniel asked the standard security questions. The man answered each one calmly. His voice carried no irritation, no sign that he was tired of the process. If anything, he seemed grateful for the teller doing his job carefully. Daniel found that strange. Most wealthy or important people he had dealt with in the past showed some impatience, but this man behaved as if patience was a natural part of him. The line behind him grew a little longer, but Daniel kept working. His fingers moved across the keyboard, filling in the fields, checking boxes, and verifying details. To anyone else, it would have looked like the dullest routine transaction. But for Daniel, there was an odd tension beneath the surface. He wanted to laugh again at the idea of serving a Hollywood superstar, yet a small flicker of doubt kept tugging at him. The man stood with his hands resting on the counter. His posture relaxed. He didn't look around nervously. He didn't try to avoid being seen. He simply waited, offering a faint smile when Daniel glanced up. It was the kind of smile that wasn't forced, the kind that carried warmth without effort, that only made Daniel more unsettled. How could someone with such an ordinary presence feel so extraordinary at the same time? As Daniel processed the request, he began to notice little things. The man's voice had a quiet confidence, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that made you feel safe. His manner was gentle, respectful, and free of ego. Daniel found himself thinking that if this really was Keanu Reeves, then maybe the stories he had read about him being humble were true. But still he wasn't ready to believe. He clicked to the next screen. The computer whirred as it processed the account details. A progress bar flickered on the monitor, and Daniel tapped his pen against the counter, trying to mask his growing curiosity. Normally, he wouldn't think twice during a routine check. But today he couldn't stop himself from stealing glances at the man, searching for any hint that might confirm or deny his suspicion. The man noticed but didn't seem offended. Instead, he gave a polite nod as though reassuring Daniel to take his time. That small gesture made Daniel pause. He felt an odd wave of respect rising in him, though he quickly shook it off with another quiet laugh, telling himself not to be so dramatic. Just another transaction, Daniel reminded himself. He repeated the phrase in his mind as though it would settle his nerves. He had processed hundreds of deposits, withdrawals and transfers in the same way. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. That was what he kept telling himself, even as his heart beat a little faster with each passing second. The routine transaction stretched on, but not because it was complicated. It stretched because Daniel was caught between disbelief and curiosity, caught between his role as a teller and his role as a man staring at someone who looked like a legend. He asked one more standard question. "Would you like to withdraw or just check the balance today?" The man answered simply, "Just checking," his voice calm and clear. Daniel nodded, fingers returning to the keyboard. He thought about how strange it was that a man who could buy anything he wanted was standing here for something so ordinary. That thought almost made him laugh again, but the laugh stayed stuck in his throat this time, because deep down he was beginning to feel the weight of the moment. As the system loaded the account, Daniel leaned back slightly. Watching the spinning icon on the screen, he sighed, pretending it was boredom, but really it was the tension building inside him. The customer's request was the simplest of all, just access to his account, nothing unusual, nothing demanding. Yet the result that would soon appear on the screen was going to shatter Daniel's casual disbelief. For now, though, it was still just a routine transaction. A teller behind his counter, a customer standing patiently. The same steps repeated 1,000 times a day. To the people waiting in line, nothing about this scene looked remarkable. But Daniel was seconds away from realizing that this routine moment was leading him straight into the most unforgettable shock of his career. Daniel stared at the spinning icon on the computer screen, tapping his pen on the counter as if the wait was just another boring delay. He glanced at the man in front of him who stood quietly, still wearing that calm, patient expression. Daniel smirked again, almost ready to make a sarcastic comment to himself. But then the screen suddenly shifted. The usual blue background of the banking system changed, and a bright red notification box popped up. It wasn't something Daniel saw every day, in fact. It was something he had only seen a few times in his entire career. The words blinked across the screen. High-profile account. Security clearance required. Daniel froze, his fingers stiff above the keyboard. For a moment he thought it must be a glitch. Maybe a technical error. The bank's software sometimes acted up, and strange alerts occasionally popped in. But then he noticed the details that appeared beneath the message. They were not random numbers or test data. They were specific, precise, and frighteningly real. The account name was highlighted, and there it was in bold letters. Keanu Charles Reeves. Daniel's smirk vanished, his stomach dropped, and his throat felt dry. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the screen as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the more he stared, the clearer it became. The account wasn't just real, it was enormous. It showed multiple international branches, flagged for special handling, and holdings that made Daniel's jaw tighten in shock. He swallowed hard, his earlier laughter echoing in his head like a cruel reminder. He had laughed at this man, dismissed him, even mocked him silently, and now the system itself was telling him the truth he didn't want to believe. This was no ordinary customer, this was Keanu Reeves, standing quietly at his counter, treating the whole interaction as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the mouse. The blinking red alert demanded extra verification steps. He clicked through them carefully, his palms sweating. Each screen confirmed what he wished wasn't true. The ID was valid, the account number matched, and the security level attached to this client was one reserved for the most high-profile individuals the bank served. He stole a glance at the man again. Keanu was still waiting patiently, his calm eyes watching Daniel without judgment. He gave a small, polite smile, as though encouraging him to take his time. That simple kindness only made Daniel's embarrassment grow heavier. He realized he had been laughing at a man who had done nothing but treat him with respect. Behind Daniel, his colleague noticed the change in his posture. She leaned slightly and whispered, "Everything okay?" Daniel nodded quickly, too embarrassed to explain. He didn't want anyone else to see the flashing alert on his screen. He didn't want them to know how foolish he had been. Laughing only minutes before, his heart pounded in his chest. He thought about the way he had smirked, the way he had whispered to his colleague earlier, the way he had dismissed the idea that Keanu Reeves would ever walk into their bank. Now all of it felt childish, almost cruel. He wished he could rewind the moment and start again, greeting him properly, treating him with the respect he deserved. The system beeped once more, drawing Daniel back to the screen. A warning flashed. "This account requires discretion. Notify branch manager if necessary." Daniel's throat tightened. Should he call his manager? Should he ask for help? He glanced at the man again, but Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply waited, calm and unbothered, as though this sort of thing had happened to him many times before. Daniel cleared his throat nervously and continued processing the request. His fingers felt stiff as they tapped at the keyboard. He kept reminding himself to breathe. His usual confidence as a teller had vanished, replaced with the anxious energy of someone who had just discovered they were standing face to face with a legend. Every detail on the screen confirmed it further. The account was tied to film projects, royalties, international transfers, and security checks at the highest level. Daniel couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was like peeking into a hidden world, one that reminded him just how far apart his ordinary life was from the man standing right in front of him. For the first time since the morning began, Daniel stopped feeling amused. He stopped thinking this was a prank or a coincidence. Instead, he felt small, humbled, and slightly ashamed. All his earlier laughter seemed foolish now. He had underestimated a man who chose to walk into a bank just like anyone else, without a trace of arrogance, without flashing his fame, without demanding special treatment. The alert stopped blinking after a while, but the weight of it lingered in Daniel's chest. He knew the truth now, undeniable and clear. This wasn't just a customer, this was Keanu Reeves, a man he had only ever seen on giant movie posters and action-packed screens. And yet here he was, standing just a few feet away, asking for something as simple as an account check. Daniel sat there frozen for a few seconds too long. The line of customers shifted behind the actor, waiting for their turn, but Daniel couldn't move. He was caught between disbelief and the reality staring him in the face. He took a deep breath, finally clicking forward to complete the process, reminding himself that he still had a job to do. As the transaction continued, Daniel's mind raced, replaying everything he had said and done since the man walked in. He remembered the chuckles, the disbelief, the whispers. He wished he could erase them, but it was too late. The only thing he could do now was finish the transaction properly, quietly and respectfully, hoping to regain even a small amount of dignity. The shocking alert had done more than confirm the truth. It had taught Daniel a lesson he would never forget. Appearances could be deceiving. Humility could hide greatness, and sometimes the most extraordinary people walk through ordinary doors, not asking for recognition, but simply carrying themselves with quiet grace. Daniel sat frozen behind the counter, staring at the computer screen as if it had betrayed him. His earlier laughter echoed in his memory, louder now than it had been when it slipped past his lips. The red alert had faded, replaced with the ordinary account dashboard, but the weight of what it revealed pressed heavily on his chest. This was real. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a coincidence. It was Keanu Reeves. His heart raced, his palms were sweaty, and yet the man standing in front of him remained calm, patient, and almost gentle in his silence. Keanu didn't look upset. He didn't even seem to notice or care that Daniel had been skeptical just moments ago. That made Daniel feel worse. He realized the contrast between them. One man carried himself with dignity. The other had been laughing at something he didn't understand. Daniel cleared his throat, hoping his voice wouldn't betray the storm inside him. Everything is fine, sir," he said quietly. His usual tone of confidence was gone, replaced with something softer, almost apologetic. He quickly clicked through the remaining screens, finishing the process with far more care than before. His fingers no longer dragged lazily across the keyboard. Now they moved with precision. As though respect could be typed into the system, inside his mind, memories surfaced of all the stories he had read about Keanu Reeves. He remembered seeing articles about him giving up his seat on the subway, donating to charity quietly, treating strangers with kindness back then. Daniel had thought those were just exaggerated tales people told to make a celebrity look good. But now, looking at the man in front of him, he understood those stories were true. Keanu stood with the same humility he was known for, his eyes calm, his posture relaxed. No sign of impatience. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't irritated. He was simply present, letting the moment unfold naturally. That simple patience hit Daniel harder than any sharp word could have. It showed him the strength of character that lay beneath the fame. Daniel felt embarrassed, not because he had been caught making fun, but because he had judged so quickly. He thought about how often he dismissed people in line, labeling them in his mind without ever knowing their real stories. A mother with a child was just a distraction. A businessman on his phone was just arrogant, an elderly couple was just slow, and now, a man in jeans and a jacket had been dismissed as a look-alike, when in reality he was someone extraordinary. The realization made Daniel's chest ache. He felt small, foolish, and humbled all at once. His earlier sense of superiority vanished completely, replaced by an awareness of how wrong he had been. He realized that humility could be far more powerful than wealth or fame. It wasn't the size of the bank account on the screen that shook him. It was the fact that a man of such status chose to carry himself without pride, without ego, without demand. He tried to mask his emotions as he handed back the ID card. His hand trembled slightly, but Keanu accepted it with a nod and a soft smile. That smile wasn't mocking. It wasn't cold, it was warm, forgiving even, as though saying, "It's okay, you didn't know." That silent kindness felt heavier than any scolding could have. It taught Daniel a lesson in humility without a single word spoken. The line behind them shifted impatiently, but Daniel barely noticed. He was too caught up in the storm inside him. He thought about how he had underestimated this man, how he had laughed, how he had assumed he understood someone's worth based on appearances. Now all those assumptions felt shallow and meaningless. In that moment, Daniel promised himself something quietly. He promised to never laugh at someone just because they didn't fit his picture of importance. He promised to never dismiss humility as ordinary. He promised to remember that real greatness often hid in simple clothes, in gentle voices and in patient smiles. The realization didn't come with fireworks or loud alarms. It came quietly, the same way Keanu himself carried it. It was like a mirror held up to Daniel's face, showing him his own flaws, showing him how quickly he judged, showing him how blind he could be to true character. As the transaction neared its end, Daniel found himself speaking more respectfully. His tone softened, his words chosen more carefully. "Thank you for your patience," he said. Almost whispering, Keanu gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the effort. It wasn't a grand exchange, but for Daniel it meant everything. The teller realized something else too. Respect wasn't just about treating celebrities kindly. It was about treating everyone kindly. The man in front of him had revealed that truth without even trying. Without arrogance, without demand, without correction. He had shown Daniel what real respect looked like. By the time Daniel clicked the final button and closed the account screen, his entire view of the morning had shifted. The bank no longer felt like a dull place filled with endless routines. It felt like a stage where life had just taught him one of the most valuable lessons. He looked at Keanu again, humbled, grateful, and deeply aware of the difference between what he had assumed and what he now knew. The teller's realization was simple but profound. He had underestimated a man because of his own limited thinking, and now he would never forget the quiet strength of humility that stood on the other side of his counter. Daniel's heart was still racing as he finalized the last step of the transaction. He couldn't bring himself to look directly at the customer for more than a few seconds. His earlier laughter replayed in his head like an embarrassing echo. He wondered if the man had noticed, if he had felt the dismissive way Daniel had treated him when he first walked in. The guilt weighed heavily on his chest. He slid the receipt across the counter with both hands, his voice quieter than usual. "Here you go, sir." Everything has been processed. He expected maybe a cold look, maybe silence, maybe even a question that would remind him of his mistake. But instead, Keanu Reeves gave him something he didn't deserve at that moment. A kind smile. That smile wasn't wide, it wasn't flashy, it was calm, genuine, the kind that made you feel as if you were forgiven before you even asked. Daniel blinked in surprise, his throat tightened. He had been bracing himself for judgment, but what he received was grace. "Thank you," Keanu said simply. His voice was soft, steady, and full of sincerity. It wasn't the thank you of a man just being polite. It was the thank you of someone who truly meant it. Daniel felt his chest tighten again. He realized that the actor had no need to show kindness, no reason to respond gently, and yet that's exactly what he chose to do. Keanu reached for the receipt, and his hand brushed the counter lightly. There was no rush in his movement, no sense of superiority, just an ordinary man finishing an ordinary task. But to Daniel, the simplicity of it all felt extraordinary. The man who had been the subject of laughter just minutes before now carried himself with quiet dignity. Daniel hesitated, then managed to say, I appreciate your patience." His words stumbled out, awkward but honest. Keanu looked at him, his expression calm. His eyes held a kind of understanding, as though he could see right through the teller's embarrassment. He gave a small nod, not needing to say anything more. That silence was more powerful than any speech. The line behind them shifted again. People were waiting, some tapping their feet, some sighing in impatience, but for Daniel, the moment stretched. It felt like time had slowed, and everything narrowed down to that quiet exchange. It wasn't about fame anymore. It wasn't about the shock of the account details. It was about the way this man responded, with humility, with patience, with kindness. Keanu could have rolled his eyes. He could have been annoyed. He could have reminded Daniel of who he was instead. He acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He accepted the teller's words, his nervousness, his clumsy tone. With the grace of someone who carried no ego, that response spoke louder than anger ever could. Daniel felt himself shrinking inside. Not out of shame this time, but out of respect. He realized that greatness wasn't about power or fame. It was about how you treated people when no one was watching. Keanu's simple words and calm presence revealed more about his character than any movie role ever could. Before leaving, Keanu placed the receipt carefully into his jacket pocket. He didn't rush. He didn't act as though he had somewhere more important to be. He simply stood there for a moment, then said in that same soft tone, "You're doing a good job. Don't worry so much." Those words struck Daniel harder than anything else. His chest tightened. He had been mocking. He had been dismissive. Yet the man in front of him chose to encourage him instead. It felt unreal, like kindness wrapped in a lesson. Daniel nodded quickly. Unable to find the right words to reply, he whispered, "Thank you," but it came out shaky. Keanu gave one last smile, not the smile of a movie star, but the smile of a man who understood people. A smile that carried forgiveness, reassurance, and quiet strength. Then he turned and walked toward the glass doors, blending back into the ordinary world as though he had never stood out in the first place. Daniel sat there frozen, watching him leave. His colleague glanced over curiously, sensing something unusual had just happened, but Daniel didn't explain. He didn't know how to put into words the feeling that filled him. It was too deep, too humbling. He felt as though he had been given a lesson without a lecture. Keanu's response had been simple. No grand gestures, no anger, no pride. Just kindness, patience, and understanding. And that simplicity made it unforgettable. It was a response that would stay with Daniel for the rest of his life. As the glass doors closed behind the actor, Daniel exhaled slowly. He didn't laugh this time. He didn't smirk. Instead, he felt quiet, thoughtful, humbled. For the first time, he realized that sometimes the greatest lessons don't come from loud moments or dramatic events. They come from the quiet grace of people who choose kindness when they could choose anything else. The glass doors closed gently behind Keanu as he stepped out into the busy street. And just like that, he was gone. To everyone else in the bank, it was just another customer leaving after completing his transaction. But for Daniel, it felt like the end of something unforgettable. He sat there quietly, his hands still resting on the counter, his mind spinning with thoughts he could not push away. The bank returned to its usual rhythm. The sound of papers shuffling, keyboards clicking, and customers chatting filled the air again. The mother with her child moved forward. The businessman was still arguing on his phone, and the elderly couple leaned on each other patiently. To them, nothing extraordinary had happened. But Daniel knew that the ordinary morning had turned into one of the most meaningful moments of his life. He looked at the empty space where Keanu had stood, replaying every second in his mind. The calm tone of his voice, the gentle smile, the patience that seemed endless. Daniel thought about his own actions, about the laughter, the arrogance, the disbelief. He had judged too quickly, and in that judgment, he had shown a side of himself he didn't like. Yet the man he underestimated had chosen to respond with kindness instead of pride. That was the lesson, and it cut deep. Greatness was not about power, money, or fame. It wasn't about the size of an account balance or the recognition of a face on a movie poster. Greatness was about humility, about treating others with respect no matter who they were. Keanu had walked into the bank with no need to announce who he was, no need to demand attention. He allowed himself to be treated like anyone else, and when treated poorly, he answered with grace. Daniel leaned back in his chair and took a long breath. The guilt he felt was heavy, but it was mixed with something else. A strange sense of gratitude. He felt thankful that he had been given the chance to see humility in action, to witness the difference between how he thought the world worked and how it truly could work. He realized that sometimes the people we underestimate carry the greatest lessons, and they don't teach by words, they teach by example. As the line of customers continued, Daniel found himself looking at each of them differently. The mother with the child was no longer just a distraction. She was someone balancing responsibility and patience. The businessman on the phone was not just arrogant. He was someone carrying the stress of deals and deadlines. The elderly couple wasn't just slow. They were partners who had walked through a lifetime together. Everyone had a story. Everyone deserved respect. That shift in his perspective felt powerful. It was as if the morning had opened his eyes in a way they had never been opened before. He realized that respect wasn't something you gave only to people who looked important. Respect was something you gave to everyone, because you never truly knew who they were, what they carried, or what lessons they might bring into your life. Daniel knew he would never forget this day years from now. He would still remember the quiet man who walked into the bank, the smirk he gave when he thought it was a joke, the shock when the alert popped up, and most of all, the gentle smile that answered his mistake. That memory would sit in the back of his mind as a reminder every time he was tempted to judge someone too quickly. He thought about how easy it was to laugh at people, to make assumptions based on appearances, to feel safe behind a counter or a roll, but after today, he also knew how dangerous that habit was. It wasn't just about embarrassing yourself. It was about missing the chance to see the truth in others. Missing the chance to learn. Keanu's visit was brief, but it left something lasting behind. It was like a small seed planted in Daniel's heart, a seed of humility, of respect, of awareness, and as the hours passed, as the bank continued its normal work, that seed grew quietly, reminding him again and again of the lesson he had been given. By the end of his shift, Daniel felt different. He couldn't explain it fully to his colleagues, so he kept it to himself. But inside, he carried a new understanding of people, of himself, and of what really mattered. He knew now that kindness could be more powerful than pride, and that humility could shine brighter than fame. When Daniel finally left the bank that evening, the city outside was alive with lights and noise. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars filled the streets, and the world moved as it always did, but for him, everything looked a little different. He saw strangers not as faces passing by, but as people with their own untold stories. He carried the reminder that every person deserved respect, because behind every quiet face might be greatness. And so the lesson stayed with him. A man he once laughed at had become the reason he would never laugh at another person the same way again. A man he underestimated had shown him the strength of patience. A man who could have walked away offended had instead left behind a memory that would guide Daniel for years. That was the legacy of the day, not the money in the account, not the shock of the alert, but the quiet reminder that humility is the truest mark of greatness.